The wind in this part of the Wyoming Territory did not just blow, it scoured. It carried a grit that settled into the deep lines of a man's face and worked its way under his eyelids until the world looked permanently brown and hazy. It was late in the 1870s, and the winter had been a long, cruel season that refused to let go of the land. April had come and gone with snow still packed hard in the gullies. And now, even as May tried to break through, the distant peaks of the Medicine Bow Mountains remained white and cold, mocking the thin, starving grass on the plains below. Luke Carver tightened the wire against the cedar post, the leather of his gloves groaning under the strain. He was a man built of hard angles and silence, much like the landscape he tried to tame. He pulled the fencing tool down, twisting the wire until it sang tight, then hammered the staple home with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded too much like a gunshot in the vast emptiness. He straightened up, rolling his left shoulder to work out the ache that lived there. It was a dull throb that flared into sharp fire whenever a storm was brewing or when he worked too hard, which was every day. The bullet that had put the ache there was long gone, dug out by a drunken doctor on a table in Cheyenne 3 years ago. But the memory of the metal stayed. It was a reminder of things he could not fix, fences he could not mend. Luke looked out over his land. It was a hard, wind-lashed piece of earth, dry and unforgiving, but it was his. A few head of cattle, ribs showing through their winter coats, grazed on the sparse tufts of grass near the creek bed. They were survivors, just like him. They had made it through the blizzards that had buried half the herds in the territory, and now they stood with their heads low against the wind, chewing slowly. His cabin sat a few hundred yards away, a small, dark shape against the pale horizon. The roof sagged slightly on the west side, and the chimney leaned, but it held. It was a lonely place. The silence here was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on a man's chest. Most days, the only voice Luke heard was the wind hissing through the sagebrush or the lowing of a calf separated from its mother. He walked to his horse, a roan gelding with a white blaze, and checked the cinch. As he swung into the saddle, the movement pulled at his bad shoulder again, and his mind drifted, as it often did when the pain bit deep, to the past. It was the injustice of it that still kept him awake on the nights when the wind died down. He remembered the smell of wet sawdust in the street of that cattle town, the bright, hard sunlight, and his younger brother, barely 20, standing with his hands raised. The boy had been foolish, perhaps, arguing over a pay packet with a rancher who owned half the valley. But he had not been armed. The rancher's foreman had shot him anyway. They called it a fair fight. The sheriff, a man with a heavy gut and pockets lined with the rancher's silver, had looked at the body in the dirt and called it justice. Luke had not. That was why Luke lived out here, on the edge of the world, away from towns and laws and men who bought the truth. He had settled the score, or tried to, and that was why he could not live in peace among people anymore. When he rode into Bitter Creek for supplies, which he did only when the flour sack was empty and the coffee was gone, the town grew quiet. It was a small, dusty collection of buildings huddled against the relentless wind, populated by people who knew the cost of survival. As Luke tied his horse to the rail outside the general store, conversations on the porch would stutter and die. Men he had known for 2 years would nod carefully, keeping their hands visible. Women would gather their skirts and turn toward the shop windows, studying goods they could not afford rather than look him in the eye. They knew who he was. They knew he was the man who had killed a gunman in the street 2 counties over. The law had ruled it self-defense, acknowledging that the other man drew first. But the stain remained. In a land where violence was common, a man who was too good at it was someone to be watched, not welcomed. Luke Carver was a dangerous man. That was the whisper. A man who had nothing to lose. And they were right. He had lost it all already. 30 miles to the east, the stagecoach rattled and swayed like a ship on a violent sea. The road to Bitter Creek was nothing more than 2 deep ruts carved into the hardpan, winding through rocky outcrops and washes that could snap a wheel axle in a heartbeat. Clara Hale sat on the hard bench seat, her fingers gripping the edge of a small, battered trunk that rested on her lap. She wore a dress of dark blue wool, the fabric fine but worn at the cuffs and hem, dusted with the gray powder of the road. It was a dress that belonged to a different life, a life of parlors and polished floors. Not this jarring, bone-shaking journey into the unknown. There were 3 other passengers in the coach. Opposite her sat a heavy-set man in a suit that was too tight, sweating despite the chill in the air, and a woman with a pinched face who held a Bible like a shield. Beside Clara sat a young clerk, nervous and twitchy, who kept glancing at her and then quickly looking away. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the window, watching the landscape roll by. It was terrifyingly empty. She had never seen so much sky, so much earth without a fence or a house to break it. It felt wild and indifferent, a place that would swallow a person whole and never notice. Yet, there was something in the wildness that called to her. It was clean. It was honest. "I heard the hotel in Bitter Creek is barely standing," the woman with the Bible said, her voice loud over the rumble of the wheels. She looked pointedly at the heavy-set man, ignoring Clara entirely. "Hardly a place for decent folk?" "It serves its purpose, ma'am," the man grunted. He shifted his weight, his eyes sliding toward Clara with a look she knew well. It was a look of speculation, of assessment. Though I suppose not everyone traveling these parts is looking for decency. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not turn. She knew what they saw. She was a woman traveling alone, with no ring on her finger and a trunk that held everything she owned. In the West, a woman without a man was suspect. A woman with her name was something worse. They whispered when they thought she could not hear. At the last way station, while she stood by the water trough washing the dust from her face, she had heard the woman muttering to the station master. "That is her," the woman had hissed. "The Hale girl. They say she was Preston Ward's plaything for 2 years. The rancher?" the station master had asked, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Thought she ran off." "She did. Ran off with a saddlebag full of his money, if you believe the stories. Or maybe he threw her out. Either way, she is fallen." Clara tightened her grip on the trunk until her knuckles turned white. Fallen. It was such a simple word for the hell she had lived. They did not know about her father, a man of weak will and grand dreams, who had gambled away their home and then, in a final act of desperation, had gambled away his daughter. They did not know about the debt Preston Ward had called in, or the way he had smiled when he told Clara that her father's safety depended entirely on her gratitude. Ward was a king in this territory. He owned the land, the water, and the law. He had bought her protection, he called it. For 2 years, she had lived in his house, trapped in a gilded cage, enduring his touch and his temper because she believed it was the only way to keep her father alive. She had been wrong. Her father had died anyway, drunk and frozen in a snowbank 6 months ago. Ward had kept the news from her, using it as leverage until she found the letter in his desk. That was the night the numbness had set in. The fear that had ruled her for so years had burned away, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. She had not stolen his money. She had taken only what was hers, her mother's locket and enough coin to buy a ticket on the first stage out of town. She was running, but she knew Ward would not let her go easily. He was a man who collected things, and he hated to lose property. The stagecoach lurched violently as it hit a deep rut, throwing Clara against the wooden wall. She gasped, clutching her ribs. "Careful there, miss," the man opposite her said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You do not want to damage the merchandise." Clara turned her head slowly and looked at him. Her eyes were green, sharp, and clear, and for a moment, the man's smile faltered. "I am not merchandise," she said, her voice low and steady. "And you would do well to keep your eyes on your own affairs." The woman with the Bible gasped, scandalized. But before she could speak, the world exploded. It began with a crack that sounded like a dry branch snapping, but much louder, the distinct report of a rifle. The coach swerved violently. The horses screamed. A terrifying, high-pitched sound of panic. "Get down!" the clerk yelled, throwing his hands over his head. Another shot rang out, and the heavy-set man jerked back against the seat, a small red hole appearing in the center of his forehead. He did not make a sound. He simply slumped forward, dead before he hit the floorboards. Clara screamed, the sound torn from her throat as the coach tilted. The horizon spun, sky, ground. Sky again, as the wheels struck a boulder and the entire carriage flipped. Wood shattered with a deafening crunch. Dust filled the air, thick and choking. Clara was thrown upward, then down, her body slamming against iron and wood. She felt a searing pain in her leg, a sharp, tearing sensation that made her vision go white. Then, everything stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. The wheels were still spinning, creaking softly. Someone was moaning low and rhythmic. The clerk, she thought. The woman with the Bible was silent. Clara lay crumpled against the roof of the overturned coach, which was now the floor. Her ears rang. She tried to move, but her right leg was pinned under a piece of the splintered seat. She tugged, and a fresh wave of agony washed over her, making her gasp for air. "Check the driver," a voice said from outside. It was a rough voice, not one she recognized. "Driver is down." "Took one in the shoulder, but he is out cold," another voice replied. "What about the inside?" Clara froze. The dust was settling, and she could see shafts of sunlight cutting through the cracks in the splintered wood. "Ward said no witnesses," the first voice said. "But he wants the girl. Alive? If she can ride. If not, he said bring the head. He wants proof she is done running." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Ward. He had sent them. These were not bandits looking for a strongbox. They were butchers looking for her. She looked around the shattered interior. The heavy-set man lay in a heap, eyes staring at nothing. The woman was unconscious, slumped in the corner. The clerk was whimpering, curled in a ball. Clara reached down to her leg. The fabric of her dress was torn, and her fingers came away wet and sticky with blood. She was trapped. "Check the door," the voice commanded. Boots crunched on the gravel. The handle of the door above her rattled, then was wrenched open. A face appeared in the opening, framed by a dirty hat and a handkerchief tied over the nose. "Well now," the man said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Looks like a mess in there." He peered down, his gaze finding Clara. "There she is," he called out. "Got her pinned like a trapped rabbit." "Is she hurt?" the other man asked from somewhere out of sight. "Looks like it. Leg is caught. Pull her out. If she cannot walk, we finish it here." The man in the door reached down, his hand grabbing Clara's arm. His grip was bruising, cruel. "Come on, darling," he grunted. "Time to go home to Mr. Ward." Clara did not think. She acted on pure instinct. Her free hand scrabbled in the debris on the floor and found a jagged shard of wood, a piece of the broken window frame, as the man yanked her upward, sending fire shooting through her injured leg. She swung the wood with all her remaining strength. It struck his wrist, the sharp point digging in. He yelped and let go, cursing. "She bit me or stabbed me, the little witch. Just shoot her and be done with it," the other man yelled. "No, Ward pays double for her alive." Clara fell back, gasping. She was dizzy. The pain in her leg was a throbbing drumbeat that was taking over her entire body. She closed her eyes, waiting for the gunshot. Bam! A shot rang out, but it did not come from the men above her. It came from the distance, echoing off the canyon walls. "What was that?" the man at the door hissed, pulling his head back. "Rider coming," the second man shouted. "From the North Ridge. Lawman? Does not look like it, but he has got a rifle." Another shot cracked through the air, closer this time. A bullet pinged off the metal rim of the coach wheel, inches from the man's head. "Let's go. It is not worth a fight with a stranger." "What about the girl?" "Leave her." "If she is hurt bad, the cold will kill her by morning anyway. Ward does not need to know." The sound of scrambling boots, then the thunder of hooves fading into the distance. Clara lay in the wreckage, trembling. The silence returned, But this time it was heavy with the promise of death. She was bleeding. She was trapped. And the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. Luke Carver had been riding the northern fence line when he heard the shots. Sound carried far in this country, bouncing off the hard earth and rock. 2 shots, then a pause, then a volley. He had pulled his horse up, his hand instantly going to the Winchester in his saddle scabbard. It was none of his business. Trouble out here usually meant someone had been foolish or greedy, and getting involved was a good way to end up dead. He looked toward the sound. The stage road ran through the canyon to the south. It was a bad spot, full of blind corners and loose rock. "Turn around," a voice in his head said. "Go back to the cabin. You have enough ghosts." But then he remembered the stage was due today, and he remembered the silence that usually followed a robbery. If they were shooting, they were killing. He cursed under his breath, a low, harsh sound, and turned the roan toward the canyon. He kicked the horse into a gallop, the animal sensing his urgency. He saw the dust before he saw the wreck. He crested the ridge just in time to see 2 men mounting their horses near the overturned coach. They were not road agents. They were riders, moving with the precision of hired guns. Luke pulled the rifle and fired a warning shot, aiming high. He didn't want to kill men he didn't know. Not if he didn't have to, but he wanted them gone. He fired again, closer, sparking the metal of the wheel. The men didn't argue. They spurred their mounts and tore off to the south, kicking up a cloud of grit. Luke kept the rifle shouldered, scanning the rocks for a third man, waiting. The wind whipped his coat around his legs. Nothing moved but the dust. He rode down slowly, his eyes on the wreck. It was a bad one. The coach was on its side, the wheels spinning lazily. One of the lead horses was down, tangled in the traces, dead. The others had broken free and vanished. He dismounted, the Winchester in the crook of his arm. The driver was slumped against a rock nearby, groaning, holding a bloody shoulder. "Easy," Luke said, his voice rusty from disuse. The driver looked up, eyes glassy. They ambushed us, just started shooting." "Stay put," Luke ordered. He walked to the coach. He saw the dead man first, the heavy suit stained dark. He saw the clerk shivering on the ground where he had crawled out. Luke climbed up on the side of the coach and looked down into the open door. A woman was lying in the debris. She was pale, her face streaked with dust and sweat. Her hair, the color of dark honey, had come loose from its pins and spilled over her shoulders, but it was the blood that caught his eye. Her skirt was soaked with it, a dark, spreading stain along her upper thigh and hip. Luke dropped down into the carriage, the wood creaking under his boots. He crouched beside her. She flinched violently, her hands coming up as if to fight him. Her eyes opened, wide and terrified. They were green, startlingly bright against the dirt on her face. "Easy," he said again, softer this time. "I am not with them." Clara stared at him. He was a big man, filling the small space. His face was shadowed by his hat, stubble darkening his jaw, a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He looked like part of the land, rough, weathered, dangerous. They left," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They ran," Luke corrected. He looked at her leg. A jagged piece of iron from the seat frame had torn through her dress and into the flesh beneath. It wasn't pinned anymore, but the wound was deep. "You are hurt bad." "I can walk," she lied, trying to push herself up. The pain hit her instantly, and she cried out, collapsing back against the wood. Luke caught her before her head hit the floor. His hand cupped the back of her neck, his other arm going around her waist. She was trembling, vibrating with shock. "Do not move," he commanded. "You will bleed out if you thrash around." He looked up at the patch of sky visible through the door. Clouds were banking in the west, heavy and purple. A storm, a bad one. He looked back at her. "I have to get you out of here." "To town?" she asked, clutching his sleeve. "Please, not to town. They will come back." Luke frowned. Not to town. That confirmed it. This wasn't a robbery. This was a hunt. "Town is 3 hours' ride," Luke said. "And there is a storm coming that will freeze you stiff before we get halfway." He made a decision. It was a foolish decision, one that would bring trouble to his door. But looking at the fear in her eyes and the blood on her dress, he saw no other choice. "My place is 2 miles north," he said. "I am taking you there." He didn't wait for an agreement. He slid his arms under her, one beneath her knees, the other behind her back. She was lighter than she looked, frail almost. Despite the fire in her eyes, he lifted her. She gasped, burying her face in his coat to stifle a scream as the movement pulled at her wound. Clara felt the strength of him, the hard wall of his chest. He smelled of sage, horse sweat, and tobacco. It was a male smell, overpowering, and for a second, panic flared, the memory of other men, other hands. But his grip was impersonal, steady. He held her as if she were a calf he was pulling from a drift, not a woman he wanted to own. He climbed out of the wreck with her, his boots finding purchase on the slick wood. Outside, the wind had picked up. It bit through her torn dress. Luke carried her to his horse. The driver was sitting up now, looking dazed. "Can you ride?" Luke asked the driver. "I think so. If I go slow." "Take the clerk's horse. The boy can ride double with you if he stops shaking." "Follow me." Luke lifted Clara toward the saddle. "Put your foot in the stirrup. On 3, 1, 2, 3. He pushed her up, and she swung her good leg over, gripping the pommel until her knuckles turned white. Luke swung up behind her. There was no room. She had to sit forward, pressing against the saddle horn, and his chest was pressed hard against her back. His arms came around her to hold the reins. "Lean back," he told her. "If you try to hold yourself up, you will pass out." Clara hesitated, then slumped back against him. The contact was shocking. She could feel the heat of his body seeping into hers, a burning contrast to the freezing wind. His chin brushed the top of her head. Luke felt her stiffen, then relax. He gritted his teeth. It had been years since he had been this close to a woman. Her hair smelled of rosewater and dust. Her body was soft where his was hard, and the way she fit against him triggered an instinct he thought he had buried with his wife. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was protectiveness, a fierce, sudden need to keep the wind off her, to keep the world from hurting her anymore. He clicked his tongue, and the horse started forward. "Hold on," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "It is going to be a rough ride." The ride took an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. The snow began to fall halfway there, small, hard pellets that stung the skin. By the time the cabin came into view, the world was gray and fading into twilight. Luke halted the horse by the door. The driver and the clerk had fallen behind but were still following, dark shapes in the snow. Luke slid off the back of the horse, his boots crunching in the mud. He reached up for Clara. She was barely conscious now, her head lolling. "I have got you," he said. He pulled her down into his arms. She was freezing, her skin clammy. The blood on her dress had darkened and stiffened in the cold. He kicked the cabin door open and carried her inside. The cabin was small. Just one room, a stove in the corner, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall. The air inside was stale and cold, but dry. Luke carried her to the bed and laid her down. The mattress was straw, covered with a rough wool blanket. He lit the kerosene lamp on the table. The golden light flared up. Pushing back the shadows, he turned to look at her. Clara lay still, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow and fast. The tear in her dress revealed the white skin of her thigh, marred by the ugly, gaping wound. It was still oozing blood, soaking the quilt. Luke felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He was good with cattle. He could stitch a horse cut on barbed wire. He had even dug a bullet out of his own leg once. But this was a woman. Her skin looked as fragile as paper. He went to the stove and stoked the embers from the morning, adding kindling until the fire roared. He filled a kettle with water and set it to boil. Then he found a bottle of whiskey on the shelf, cheap, harsh stuff he kept for bad nights. He washed his hands in a basin of cold water, scrubbing them with a block of lye soap until the skin was red. His hands were large, scarred from work, the knuckles swollen. They were hands made for breaking horses and building fences, not for touching silk and soft skin. He walked back to the bed. He set the whiskey and a clean rag on the chair. He had to clean the wound. He had to stitch it. And to do that, he had to cut the dress. He looked at Clara's face. She was watching him now. Her eyes slitted open. She looked terrified, huddled against the wall as if expecting a blow. "I have to clean it," Luke said, his voice feeling too loud in the small room. "I have to stop the bleeding." Clara nodded weakly. She did not speak. She just watched his hands. Luke took a knife from his belt. He hesitated, his hand hovering over her leg. A tremor went through his fingers, just a slight shake, but he saw it. He took a breath, steeling himself. He was alone with a strange woman, miles from anywhere, about to put his hands on her in a way that felt dangerously intimate. "I'm sorry," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He lowered the knife and began to cut the fabric. The air in the cabin was heavy, a suffocating mixture of wood smoke, old dust, and the sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood. The storm outside had thrown its full weight against the timber walls, the wind howling like a wounded animal, rattling the single window pane in its frame. But inside, the silence was louder. It was a dense, vibrating silence, broken only by the hiss of the kettle on the iron stove and the ragged, shallow breathing of the woman on the bed. Luke Carver stood by the bedside, his large frame casting a long, flickering shadow in the yellow light of the kerosene lamp. He felt too big for the room, too rough for the task at hand. His hands, scarred from barbed wire and rope, trembled slightly as he uncorked the bottle of whiskey. The smell of the cheap liquor hit the air, harsh and stinging, warring with the scent of blood. Clara Hale lay pale and shivering against the gray wool of his blankets. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her knuckles white where she gripped the edges of the mattress. The mud from the road was smeared across her cheek, and her dress, the fine blue wool that spoke of a life he did not understand, was ruined, soaked dark and stiff around her hip. "I have to cut the dress, ma'am," Luke said. His voice sounded like gravel grinding together, low and apologetic. "I cannot get to the wound otherwise. The fabric is stuck." Clara did not answer immediately. She nodded. A jerky, small movement. She felt filthy. The road dust was in her hair and under her fingernails. But the filth she felt went deeper than that. It was the grime of the last 2 years, the invisible stain of Preston Ward's hands, the whispers of the town, the way men looked at her as if she were a piece of livestock to be assessed and bartered. And now, this stranger, this rough, silent man who had pulled her from the wreckage, was going to see her. He was going to strip away the last layer of her defense. "Do what you must," she whispered, her voice tight. Luke took the knife from the table. He had sharpened it that morning on a whetstone, a habit of discipline, and the blade glinted in the lamplight. He moved carefully, treating the fabric as if it were explosive. He inserted the tip of the blade into the hem of the torn skirt, just below the injury, and sliced upward. The sound of the wool tearing was loud in the small room. Luke worked with a grim focus, his jaw set hard. He peeled back the layers of heavy cloth, then the linen petticoats beneath, which were sodden with red. He tried to keep his eyes strictly on the injury, treating it like a puzzle to be solved, a fence to be mended. But as the fabric fell away, revealing the curve of her hip and the pale, smooth skin of her upper thigh, his throat went dry. The wound was ugly, a long, jagged tear where the iron had gouged her, angry and weeping blood, but the skin around it was startlingly white, soft and terrifyingly feminine against the darkness of his calloused hands. "I'm sorry," he muttered again, the words clumsy. "I know this is not... I am sorry." Clara tried to pull the shredded remains of her skirt across her lap, shielding what she could. She turned her head toward the wall, unable to watch him. She waited for the change. She knew the way men's breathing shifted when they saw a woman vulnerable. She knew the sudden heaviness in the air, the greed that replaced compassion. She lay rigid, every muscle locked, waiting for his hands to become cruel, "This is going to sting," Luke warned. "I have to clean the dirt out before I stitch it." He poured the whiskey onto a clean rag. The fumes rose up, biting at his nose. He stepped closer, his knee bracing against the edge of the bed frame to steady himself. He dabbed at the wound. Clara gasped, a sharp, sucked-in breath that sounded like a sob. Her body bucked involuntarily against the pain. "Easy," Luke murmured, sweating now. "Easy. I know it hurts." He worked quickly. Wiping away the dried blood and the grit from the road, he had to be thorough. Infection out here killed faster than a bullet. He leaned in, his brow furrowed in concentration, his world narrowing down to the red gash and the white skin. And then, it happened. He was reaching for a spot of dried blood near the top of the wound, high on her outer thigh. The cabin floor was uneven, and as he shifted his weight, his boot slipped on the rough planks. His hand jerked to steady himself. His heavy, rough palm slid. It moved past the wound, sliding upward and inward, over the curve of her hip and brushing the soft, sensitive skin of her inner thigh, a place no stranger had any right to touch. His fingers, calloused and warm, rested there for a heartbeat, dangerously close to the heat of her groin. Time seemed to snap and freeze. Clara stopped breathing. Her eyes flew open, wide and dark with shock. The sensation was electric, not the pain she expected, but a sudden, terrifying jolt of intimacy. His hand was large and hot, his skin rough against her softness. It was a violation. Yet it wasn't. It didn't feel like Ward's possessive grip. It felt heavy, grounding, and shockingly human. Luke went rigid. The breath trapped in his lungs burned. He could feel the pulse of her blood beneath his fingertips, the terrible softness of her, the heat radiating through the thin barrier of her skin. For that single, suspended second, the medical emergency vanished. He was a man, alive and starving, touching a woman in the darkness of a storm. A sudden, blazing desire roared through him, fierce and hungry, an ache he hadn't felt since before the grief had hollowed him out. The silence in the room thickened, becoming a physical thing that pressed against their eardrums. The air crackled with shame and a raw, unwanted want. Then Luke jerked his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. He stumbled back a step, nearly knocking over the basin of water. His face flushed a deep, brick red that was visible even in the dim light. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at her, at the floor, at the stove, at his own traitorous hands. "I slipped. My boot. I did not mean—" He trailed off, mortified. He felt a sick wave of self-hatred. "Animal," he thought viciously. "She is hurt. She is bleeding. And you are putting your hands on her like that?" He was terrified that she would see him as another predator, another man taking what he wanted because she was too weak to stop him. Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. The heat of his touch still lingered on her skin. A phantom pressure. She had flinched when he slipped, expecting him to press his advantage, to turn the accident into an assault, but he was backing away. He was stuttering. She looked at his face. She didn't see the leer she was used to. She didn't see the cold calculation of Preston Ward. She saw a man who looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. His eyes were wide with panic and a profound, boyish shame. It confused her. The rush of heat she had felt, that strange, treacherous spark in her own belly, was frightening. But his reaction was even more unsettling. He was afraid of hurting her. He was afraid of her fear. "It is all right," she said, her voice trembling. It wasn't all right. Not really. The air between them had changed. It was charged now, dangerous in a new way. Luke took a ragged breath. He forced himself to look at her leg again, but he kept his eyes strictly on the wound, refusing to let his gaze wander even an inch. He had to finish this. He had to be professional. He had to build a wall of duty between himself and the fire that had just sparked in his chest. "I have to stitch it now," he said, his voice flat and controlled. "I'm going to thread the needle. I will be quick." He returned to the bedside. But his movements were different now. They were rigid, mechanical. He kept his elbows tucked in, his body angled away from her as much as possible. When he had to touch her skin to hold the wound closed, he used only the tips of his fingers, touching her as lightly as if she were made of glass. "Needle going in," he announced softly. "Hold still." He talked through the whole process, narrating his actions in a low murmur. "1 stitch. Almost done with this part. I am tying the knot. Now the next one. You are doing well. Just breathe." He used the words like a shield. If he kept talking, if he kept explaining, then the silence couldn't come back. If he kept it clinical, he could pretend that his hand didn't still burn with the memory of her skin. He could pretend that the smell of her, sweat and rosewater and fear, wasn't making his head spin. Clara lay still, biting her lip until it tasted of copper. She focused on his voice. It was a deep voice, rough like the land, but there was a kindness in it that she hadn't heard in a long time. She watched his face as he worked. He was frowning in concentration, a bead of sweat tracking through the soot on his temple. He wasn't Ward. He wasn't the men on the stagecoach. He was Luke, and that realization terrified her more than the gunshots had. "There," Luke said, tying off the final stitch. He didn't look up. He reached for the clean linen strips he had prepared. "I am wrapping it now. Not too tight." He bandaged the wound efficiently, his hands quick and sure. When he was finished, he pulled the blanket up to her chin, covering her completely, hiding the torn dress and the bandaged leg. "Try to sleep," he said. He turned away abruptly, blowing out the lamp before she could see the look in his eyes. The darkness rushed back in, absolute and heavy. "Thank you," Clara whispered into the dark. "Do not thank me," Luke said from the shadows. His voice was harsh. "Get some sleep." He took the extra quilt from the shelf and walked to the far side of the cabin. Near the door, he spread it on the rug, as far from the bed as he could get in the small space. He lay down, fully clothed, staring up at the invisible ceiling beams. Outside, the wind hammered against the logs. Inside, the only sound was the fire dying in the stove. Luke lay rigid on the hard floor. His shoulder ached, but he barely felt it. All he could feel was the ghost of that touch. He closed his eyes and tried to summon the face of his wife, tried to remember the sound of her laugh, but the image was hazy, distant. Instead, his mind kept replaying that single second, the slip of his boot, the slide of his hand, the sharp intake of Clara's breath. Guilt washed over him, cold and heavy. He was a man protecting a vulnerable woman, and he had let himself feel desire. It felt like a betrayal of his duty, a betrayal of his grief. But beneath the guilt, there was an ache he couldn't deny. It was a loneliness that had been starved for so long it had turned into a physical hunger. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to feel that warmth again. He rolled over, turning his back to the room, cursing himself silently in the dark. Hours passed. The storm began to break, the wind dying down to a low moan. Clara drifted in a feverish sleep, her dreams fragmented and sharp. She was back in the stagecoach, but the walls were closing in. Then she was in Ward's study, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the sun. Ward was there, his face smooth and smiling. "You belong to me." "Clara," he said, his voice like oil. "You are property. You have always been property." He reached for her. His hands were cold, like iron. They clamped around her arms, pulling her down. "No," she whimpered in her sleep. "No, please." The hands tightened. Ward laughed. "There is nowhere to run. Clara, the world is mine." "No!" Clara gasped, jerking awake. She sat up, her heart pounding, the scream dying in her throat. The darkness of the cabin was disorienting. She didn't know where she was. She reached out blindly, her hand seeking a wall, a door, anything. "Clara?" The voice came from the floor. Then there was movement. A shadow detached itself from the gloom and was beside her in an instant. "Clara, you are safe," Luke said. His voice was rough with sleep but urgent. "You are safe." She couldn't see his face, just the outline of his shoulders. Panic was still clawing at her throat. She reached out and her hand found his forearm. She gripped it hard, her fingers digging into the muscle. He was here, she gasped, her breath hitching. He said, "No one is here," Luke said. He didn't pull away. He didn't try to hold her. He just let her anchor herself to him. He was a solid, immovable presence in the shifting dark. It was a dream, just a dream. Clara clutched his wrist, feeling the steady beat of his pulse beneath the skin. It was real. He was real. The nightmare receded, leaving her shaking and cold. They stayed like that for a long moment in the dim gray light of pre-dawn, her hand on his arm, his silhouette looming protectively over her, their breathing slowly sinking in the quiet room. Clara looked up at him, her eyes adjusting to the dark. She could see the gleam of his eyes watching her. There was no judgment there, only a quiet vigilance. "I am sorry," she whispered, loosening her grip. I got scared." "Do not be sorry," Luke said gently. He waited until her hand fell away before he stepped back. The loss of contact felt like a sudden drop in temperature. "Go back to sleep. I will be right here." He went back to his rug, but neither of them slept again. The morning broke cold and clear. The sky a piercing, brilliant blue that hurt the eyes. The storm had scrubbed the world clean, leaving the plains white with snow that would melt by noon. Luke rose before the sun. He moved quietly, checking the stove, putting coffee on to boil. His face was set in grim lines. He had a plan, and he didn't like it, but it was necessary. He helped the stagecoach driver, a man named Miller, out to the wagon. Miller was pale and shaky, his arm in a sling Luke had fashioned from a flour sack. "I am taking you to the Jensens," Luke told him as he hitched the team. "They are 5 miles east. They can get you to a doctor in town." Miller nodded, wincing as he climbed onto the wagon seat. "What about the girl, Miss Hale?" Luke tightened the cinch on the saddle horse he would ride alongside the wagon. He didn't look at Miller. "You did not see her," Luke said flatly. Miller blinked. "But she was in the wreck. I saw you carry her." Luke turned, resting his hand on the wagon wheel. His eyes were hard, the color of flint. "The men who hit that coach were looking for her. Miller, if word gets out she is here, they will come back. And next time they won't just leave. They will burn this whole valley down." Miller swallowed. He was a simple man who wanted no part of a range war. I understand. She ran off, into the storm, died out there. Most likely." "That is the story," Luke confirmed. "Stick to it." He didn't tell Clara he was leaving. He didn't want to wake her, and he didn't want to explain why he was hiding her existence like a shameful secret. He just rode out, the wagon rattling behind him, leaving her alone in the silence of the cabin. It took 3 hours to get Miller to the Jensens and return. When Luke rode back into his yard, the sun was high and the snow was already turning to mud. Smoke was rising from his chimney. He swung down from the saddle, anxiety spiking in his chest. He pushed the door open. Clara was not in bed. She was standing by the table, clutching the edge for support. She had found one of his old flannel shirts and pulled it on over her ruined dress. It swallowed her small frame, hanging to her knees. Her face was gray with pain, sweat beading on her upper lip. But her jaw was set in a line of stubborn determination. "What are you doing?" Luke demanded, stepping inside. "You should not be up." Clara jumped at his voice. She tried to turn toward him, but her injured leg buckled. Her knee gave way, and she pitched forward with a cry. Luke moved faster than a man his size should have been able to. He crossed the room in 2 strides and caught her before she hit the floor, his arm hooked around her waist, hauling her up against him. Her hands grabbed his shoulders to steady herself. For a moment, they were pressed together, chest to chest, thigh to thigh. The impact knocked the wind out of both of them. Clara's face was buried in the crook of his neck. Luke could feel the heat of her body through his coat, the softness of her curves against his rigid frame. The smell of her hair filled his nose again, sweeter than the sagebrush outside. Clara gasped, looking up. Her face was inches from his. She saw his pupils dilate, the sudden flare of heat in his eyes that mirrored the jolt in her own stomach. His grip on her waist tightened instinctively, his fingers digging into the flannel shirt. The memory of the night before, the slip of his hand, the darkness, rushed back between them, unspoken and heavy. Clara breathed, her voice failing. Luke stared at her mouth. He wanted to kiss her. The thought was so sudden and so violent it terrified him. He practically threw her back toward the bed, stepping away as if she were contagious. "You need to stay off that leg," he barked, his voice rough with panic. He turned his back on her, ripping his hat off and running a hand through his hair. "Do you want to rip the stitches out? Do you want to bleed to death?" Clara sank onto the mattress, her heart pounding. She pulled the blanket around herself, her face burning. "I just wanted water," she said defensively. "I am not an invalid. I cannot just lie here." "You will lie there until I say you can get up," Luke snapped, grabbing the water bucket. "I will not have you dying on my floor after I spent half the night sewing you back together." He stormed out the door to the well, needing the cold air to cool the blood that was roaring in his ears. The days that followed fell into a strange, wary rhythm. The cabin was too small for two people who were trying so hard to avoid each other. It was a dance of small intimacies. Luke cooked, his large frame filling the space by the stove as he fried bacon or stirred beans. Clara watched him from the bed, her eyes following the line of his back, the way his muscles moved under his shirt. She saw the care he took, the way he saved the best pieces of meat for her plate. He fetched water, the bucket clanking as he set it down. He changed her bandages every morning and evening. That was the hardest time. The air would grow thin and tight. Clara would pull up the skirt, exposing the wound. Luke would wash his hands, his face shutting down into a mask of concentration. He would touch her only where he had to, his fingers quick and clinical. But the memory of that first night lay between them like a loaded gun. "How does it look?" Clara asked on the third day, trying to fill the silence. "Healing," Luke said shortly. "The redness is going down." You have gentle hands," she said. Luke froze for a second while wrapping the fresh linen. He didn't look up. "I have hands that work cattle. Miss Hale, nothing gentle about them." "I know what cruel hands feel like," Clara said softly. "Yours are not cruel." Luke finished the knot and stood up quickly, retreating to the other side of the room. "I'm going to check the fence line," he muttered, grabbing his hat. "I will be back by dark." He spent as much time outside as he could, working himself to exhaustion. He fixed fences that didn't need fixing. He chopped enough wood for 2 winters. He rode the perimeter of his land, watching the horizon for dust, for riders, for the past coming to collect. But he always had to come back. The evenings were the worst. The wind would pick up, sealing them inside the small wooden box of the cabin. They sat by the light of the single lamp. Clara mended his torn shirts, her fingers working the needle with a skill he lacked. Luke cleaned his rifle, the smell of gun oil mixing with the scent of the stew on the stove. They talked, but only about safe things. "Snow is melting fast," Luke would say. "The grass looks greener today." Clara would reply, "Creek is rising. I saw a hawk this morning." They built a bridge of small talk over the chasm of their shared silence. They never spoke of Preston Ward. They never spoke of the man Luke had killed. They never spoke of the night she had arrived. But the silence spoke for them. At night, after Luke blew out the lamp and lay down on his rug, the cabin became a chamber of echoes. Clara would lie in the bed, staring into the dark. She could hear Luke breathing on the floor 6 feet away. She could hear him shift, trying to find a comfortable spot on the hard wood. She thought about the way he had caught her, the way his body felt against hers, solid, unyielding, safe. She thought about his hands. She wondered, with a shiver of shame and curiosity, what it would feel like if he didn't pull away, what it would feel like if he touched her not to heal, but to hold. Luke lay awake, staring at the embers fading in the stove. He listened to the rustle of the sheets as she turned. He imagined her lying there, warm and soft. The desire he was trying to starve was only growing stronger. feeding on the proximity, on the stolen glances. On the way, the light caught her hair. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his boots. He knew he should take her to town. He knew he should put her on a stage and send her far away, where she would be safe, where he would be safe. But every morning, when he looked at her sitting up in his bed, looking a little stronger, a little less haunted, he found a reason to wait one more day. The leg needs more time, he would tell himself. Just one more day. And the cracks in their defenses grew wider, letting the light and the danger seep in. 2 weeks had passed since the storm, and the spring thaw had finally taken hold of the Wyoming plains. The snow had retreated to the high crevices of the Medicine Bow Mountains, leaving the earth below sodden and dark, a vast ocean of mud and new, tentative grass. Clara Hale stood by the door of the cabin, testing her weight on her injured leg. The pain was still there, a dull, throbbing reminder of the iron that had torn her flesh, but the wound had closed. The angry red inflammation had faded to a bruised purple, and the stitches Luke had placed with such terrifying precision held the skin together. She could walk, though it was with a hitch in her stride, a limp that made her feel broken in a new way. Luke was by the corral, hitching the roan and the mare to the buckboard wagon. He moved with the same economy of motion he applied to everything. No wasted energy, just strength applied where it was needed. He wore his coat, the leather cracked and worn white at the elbows, and his hat was pulled low against the morning sun. He walked back to the cabin, stopping at the foot of the porch. He did not look at her directly, his gaze fixed somewhere on the horizon. "It is time," he said. His voice was flat. "You can travel now. I will take you into Bitter Creek. You can decide what you want to do from there." Clara tightened her grip on the doorframe. The cabin had been a strange limbo, a place suspended out of time. It was small, cramped, and smelled of wood smoke and coffee, but it was safe. Outside lay the world that wanted to chew her up. Outside lay Preston Ward. "Yes," she said, though the word felt like a stone in her throat. "I suppose I must." She gathered her few things, the trunk that had survived the crash, the torn dress she had mended as best she could. Luke had given her an old duster coat to wear, as the wind was still biting. It was miles too big for her, the shoulders hanging down her arms, the hem brushing her ankles. It smelled of him, tobacco, horse, and the pine scent of the mountains. Wrapping it around herself felt like stepping into armor that didn't fit. Luke helped her onto the wagon seat. He offered his hand, and for a moment, his rough palm swallowed hers. His grip was firm, impersonal, yet the contact sent a jolt through her that made her breath hitch. He released her the instant she was settled, climbing up the other side and taking the reins. "Here!" he called to the horses. The wagon lurched forward, the wheels grinding through the mud. They left the cabin behind, a lonely speck of timber against the immense backdrop of the plains. The silence on the ride was thick. The landscape stretched out endlessly, a terrifying expanse of nothingness under a hard, cloudless sky. The wind whipped the grass into waves, a relentless motion that made the earth seem like a restless sea. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. Luke kept his eyes on the ears of the horses, his profile etched in stone. Clara watched his hands on the leather reins. They were capable hands. She remembered the way they had shaken, just slightly, when he cleaned her wound. She remembered the slip, the heat, the terrifying moment of stillness. She looked away, staring at the distant line of the mountains. "You have been kind to me, Mr. Carver," she said, her voice small against the wind. "I know I have been a burden." Luke shrugged, a shift of his heavy shoulders. "I would have done the same for a dog caught in a trap." It was a harsh answer, but Clara heard the defense in it. He did not want gratitude. Gratitude implied a connection. "They say I am a whore," she said suddenly. The words hung in the air, stark and ugly. Luke's hands tightened on the reins, the leather creaking. He did not turn his head. "I do not listen to what they say." "You should," Clara said, a bitter edge entering her voice. Because that is what you will hear in town. That is what Preston Ward made sure everyone thinks. She took a breath, the cold air filling her lungs. She wanted him to know. She didn't want to be the mystery woman in his cabin anymore. She wanted to be real, even if the reality was ugly. My father owed Ward $3,000, she said, staring at the horizon. He was a weak man. He liked cards better than he liked working, and he liked whiskey better than he liked me. Ward came to the house one night. He put a piece of paper on the table. He said he would forgive the debt if I came to live at his ranch. He called it protection. He said a woman alone would not survive when my father inevitably failed. Luke remained silent, but his jaw muscle jumped. I went, Clara continued, her voice trembling. I thought I was saving my father, but Ward did not want a housekeeper, and he did not want a wife. He wanted something he could own completely. He wanted me to be grateful for the cage. She looked down at her hands, clenched in her lap. I refused him. Not at first. At first, I was too scared. But later, I locked my door. I refused to dine with him. I told him I would work off the debt in the kitchen, in the stables, anywhere but his bed. She laughed, a dry, brittle sound. That is when he started talking. He told his men I was wild. He told the town I was insatiable. He made sure that if I ever left, no decent person would look at me. He bought my reputation just like he bought my father's dignity. Luke was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of hooves and the creak of the wagon springs. My brother was 20 years old, Luke said. The sudden shift surprised her. She turned to look at him. Matt, Luke said. He was loud, laughed at everything. Not like me. He had a claim on a strip of water north of Bitter Creek. The Circle T Ranch wanted it. They cut his fences 3 times. The 4th time, Matt rode into town to talk to the owner. Luke's eyes narrowed, looking at something far beyond the road. He did not even have his gun drawn. He was shouting, waving his arms. The foreman shot him in the chest, said he felt threatened. Luke, Clara whispered. The sheriff, Luke went on, his voice devoid of emotion. Said it was a fair fight. He said Matt was known to be hot-headed. They buried him on the hill, and the Circle T took the water. He turned to look at her then, his eyes dark and shadowed. That is why I am out here. Clara, the law is just a way for rich men to give names to their crimes. You and I, we are just the things in their way. It was the first time he had used her name. It felt like a physical touch. The town of Bitter Creek appeared as a smear of brown against the green-gray plains. As they drew closer, the buildings resolved into shape, rough-hewn timber, false fronts trying to look grand. Mud streets churned by wagons and cattle. Luke drove the wagon down the main street. It was midday, and the town was busy. Men hauled crates on the boardwalks. Horses stood dozing at the hitching rails. When the wagon rolled past the saloon, conversation stopped. Clara felt the weight of the eyes. She pulled Luke's coat tighter around her, shrinking inside the heavy wool. She saw a woman sweeping a porch pause, leaning on her broom, her eyes narrowing as she took in the strange tableau. Luke Carver, the man who killed, and the woman beside him. That is her, a voice drifted from the boardwalk. The Hale girl. Thought she was dead. Look at her, riding with him. Fits, does it not? Luke stared straight ahead, his face a mask of granite. He pulled the wagon up in front of the livery stable. I have to get supplies, he said. Flour, coffee. You can wait here, or... I will look for work, Clara said, straightening her spine. She would not hide. I need money if I am to leave. Luke looked at her, doubt flickering in his eyes. Clara, I will be fine, she lied. She climbed down, wincing as her bad leg took her weight. She smoothed her hair, though she knew she looked wild, and limped toward the boarding house across the street. The sign above the door said, Mrs. Gable's Rooms and Meals. Clara pushed the door open. The air inside smelled of beeswax and stewed onions. Mrs. Gable was behind the desk, a stout woman with a face like a dried apple. She smiled reflexively as the door opened, but the smile died the instant she recognized Clara. I have no rooms. Mrs. Gable said sharply. I am not looking for a room, Clara said, holding her head high. I am looking for work. I can cook. I can clean. I sew better than anyone in the territory. Mrs. Gable looked down at her ledger. I have no work. Please, Clara said, desperation leaking into her voice. I am hard-working. I just need a chance. Mrs. Gable looked up, her eyes hard. Miss Hale, my husband does business with the bank. The bank does business with Mr. Ward. If I hire you, half this town will stop eating at my table. I cannot afford pity. Clara stood there for a moment, feeling the blood drain from her face. It is not pity I am asking for, she said quietly. It is decency. Then you are looking in the wrong town, Mrs. Gable said. Turning her back, Clara walked out. The street felt colder than before. She tried the schoolhouse. The teacher, a young man with spectacles, turned red and stammered that the school board would never approve someone with her history. Around the children, she tried the Chinese laundry at the end of town. The owner looked at her sadly and shook his head, making a cutting motion across his throat, whispering the name Ward. An hour later, Clara stood outside the general store, defeated. The wind was picking up, blowing dust into her eyes. She felt small and dirty, the whispers of the town feeling like physical blows. Well now, look what the cat dragged in. Clara stiffened. A man detached himself from the wall of the saloon and shambled toward her. He was big, smelling of stale beer and unwashed skin. She recognized him vaguely. A ranch hand she had seen riding for Ward years ago. Preston said you ran off, the man slurred. Stopping too close? Said you stole from him. Get away from me, Clara said, stepping back. Her back hit the wooden post of the porch. You do not look like a thief, the man laughed. A wet, ugly sound. He reached out, his dirty fingers brushing the sleeve of Luke's coat. You look like you need a friend, someone to warm you up. That scar-faced killer cannot be much comfort. Do not touch me, Clara hissed. Come on, the man sneered. We all know what you are. Ward said you liked it rough, said you begged for it. He grabbed her arm. His grip was clammy and tight. Clara cried out, trying to pull away, but her bad leg gave out and she stumbled. Suddenly, the man was ripped away from her. It happened so fast she barely saw it. One moment the man was looming over her, the next he was flying backward, crashing into the dust of the street. Luke stood between them. He didn't look like a rancher now. He looked like death. His shoulders were hunched, his hands curled into fists at his sides. The drunk scrambled up, spitting blood. You crazy son of a... Luke took a step forward. It was a quiet movement, terrifying in its control. He reached out and grabbed the man by the lapels of his vest, lifting him onto his toes. You touch her again, Luke said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the silent street. And I will not just throw you in the dirt. Do you understand me? The man's eyes went wide. He looked at Luke's face, at the scar, at the cold promise in his eyes. He nodded frantically. Luke shoved him back. The man stumbled and turned, fleeing toward the saloon. Luke turned to Clara. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. Are you hurt? Clara shook her head, unable to speak. She was trembling. A crowd had gathered. They were watching, judging. Luke looked around at them. His gaze swept over the shopkeepers, the cowboys, the women in their bonnets. He reached out and took Clara's arm, pulling her to his side. It wasn't a gentle grip. It was possessive, solid. She is with me, Luke announced. He didn't shout, but his voice cut through the wind. She is under my protection. Any man who has a problem with that can take it up with me. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. Then, slowly, the crowd began to disperse. They turned away, muttering, but they moved. Luke Carver had drawn a line in the dust. Clara felt a strange, dizzying mixture of warmth and terror. He had claimed her. In the eyes of this town, she was now his. It was safety. Yes, but it was also a target painted on his back. Luke, she whispered. You should not have... Get in the wagon, he said, his jaw tight. As he turned to help her up, A shadow fell over them. Sheriff Brady stood on the boardwalk, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. He was an older man with gray eyes that gave away nothing. That was a bold thing to do. "Carver," the sheriff said. He put his hands on her. Luke said, not backing down. "I saw," the sheriff said. He stepped down into the street, walking close to the wagon. He lowered his voice. "Word is, Preston Ward is looking for his property. He says she took things that do not belong to her." "She is not property," Luke said. "Ward thinks differently," the sheriff said. He looked at Clara, his expression unreadable. "And Ward has a long reach. Accidents happen. Luke, barns burn down. Men get shot by mistake on the trail. If I were you, I would be careful who I sheltered." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" "It is advice," the sheriff said. "Take her back to him, or put her on a train to California. But do not keep her here. This town does not want a war." The sheriff turned and walked away. Luke stood still for a moment, watching him go. Then he climbed into the wagon and snapped the reins. They did not speak of leaving. It was understood. The town had rejected them. They stopped at the boarding house only long enough for Luke to ask Mrs. Gable for a hot meal to take with them. Mrs. Gable refused to look at Clara, handing the wrapped parcel to Luke with shaking hands. While Luke was paying, Clara stood in the narrow hallway. The door to the parlor was ajar. "Shameful," a woman's voice drifted out. "Did you see how she looked at him? Like a stray dog." "She will drag him down," another voice agreed. "Luke Carver has enough blood on his hands. Now he has taken up with a harlot. He is a fool. She will be the death of him. Mark my words. She is poison." Clara backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Poison." She hurried out to the wagon, climbing up before Luke could see her face, but her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't clasp her cloak. They rode out of town as the sun began to dip toward the mountains, casting long, bruised shadows across the plains. The wind had turned cold again. The ride back to the cabin was a nightmare of silence. Luke was lost in his own thoughts, the sheriff's warning ringing in his ears. He felt the weight of what he had done. He had made himself an enemy of the most powerful man in the territory. He had put everything he had left, his land, his life, on the line. And for what? For the woman sitting beside him, shivering in his coat. Clara sat with her eyes closed, the women's voices echoing in her mind. She will be the death of him. They arrived at the cabin after dark. Luke unhitched the horses and turned them into the corral. When he came inside, Clara was standing by the table, frantically packing the few things she had taken out of her trunk. "What are you doing?" Luke asked, closing the door against the wind. "I am leaving," Clara said. Her voice was brittle, high-pitched. "I cannot stay here." Luke frowned, pulling off his gloves. "Leaving? To go where? It is pitch black. The horses are tired." "I will walk," Clara said. She shoved her brush into the trunk. "I will walk to the next town. I will catch a train." "You have a bad leg," Luke said, his voice rising. "You will not make it 5 miles. Stop this." "I have to go." Clara spun around, her eyes wild. "Did you not hear them? Did you not hear the sheriff? Ward is coming. He will burn you out. He will kill you. Luke, just like they killed your brother." Luke stiffened. "I can handle Ward." "No, you cannot," Clara cried. She took a step toward him, pleading, "I am poison. Luke, everyone says it. I ruin everything I touch. My father, the boarding house. Now you, I will not let you die because of me." "I make my own choices," Luke growled, stepping forward. "Do not tell me what I can and cannot do. I chose to bring you here. I chose to stand up in that street." "And it was a mistake," Clara shouted, tears finally spilling over. "Why are you doing this? Why are you fighting for me? I am nothing. I am just the girl who ran." "Because you are here," Luke roared back. The silence that followed was deafening. The fire in the stove popped, a sharp sound in the sudden quiet. Luke breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling. He looked at her, her tear-streaked face, her hair wild from the wind, the fierce, desperate set of her jaw. "I am not my brother," Luke said, his voice lower, rougher. "And you are not nothing." "I am dangerous to you," Clara whispered. "Please, Luke, let me go." She reached for her trunk again. Luke moved. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides. He grabbed her wrist, not to hurt her, but to stop her. "No," he said. Clara looked up at him, startled by the heat of his hand. It was the same hand that had slipped on her skin weeks ago. The memory of it crashed between them, visceral and sudden. "Why?" she demanded, her voice shaking. She grabbed his wrist with her free hand, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in the world. "Why do you care?" Luke looked down at her. They were inches apart. He could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. He could smell the dust and the rosewater. He felt the pulse beating frantically in her wrist beneath his fingers. He remembered the texture of her thigh. He remembered the sound of her breath in the dark. He remembered the way she had looked at him in the street, with terror, but also with trust. "Because," Luke murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He stepped closer. His gaze dropped to her mouth. The air in the cabin seemed to ignite. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a raw, desperate hunger. It was the need of 2 people who had been lonely for a lifetime, suddenly finding the one thing that fit. Clara's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. She leaned in, just a fraction, her lips parting. Luke's hand slid from her wrist up to her forearm. He wanted to pull her against him. He wanted to bury his face in her neck and forget the town, forget Ward, forget the ghosts. But then he saw the fear behind the desire in her eyes. He saw the vulnerability. "She is under my protection," he had said. If he touched her now, in anger and fear, he was no better than the men who had used her. Luke clenched his jaw so hard it ached. He forced himself to freeze. The fire in his chest was agonizing, a physical pain. He released her wrist and stepped back. He put 3 feet of cold air between them. "You are staying," he said, his voice sounding like it was torn from his throat. "Because I said so, and because I am not going to let them win." He turned his back on her, walking to the window to stare out at the dark, empty plains, his hands shaking at his sides. Clara stood by the table, clutching her wrist where he had held her, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt cold without him, and the terrifying realization settled over her. She didn't want to leave, not because she was afraid of the road, but because she was afraid of a life without him. "Luke," she whispered. He didn't turn. "Go to bed, Clara." It was a command, but it sounded like a plea. Clara looked at his broad back, at the tension in his shoulders. She slowly unbuttoned the heavy coat and let it slide to the floor. She walked to the bed and sat down, but she didn't sleep. She watched him standing guard against the night, and she knew, with a sinking dread, that the storm was only just beginning. The world began to close in on Luke Carver's land like a noose tightening around a throat. It started with the silence. The usual bird song that greeted the dawn seemed muted, and the wind carried a tension that pricked at the back of the neck. Then came the riders who did not stop but watched from the ridge lines, dark silhouettes against the blinding blue of the Wyoming sky. 3 days after their return from Bitter Creek, a neighbor named Silas Jensen rode up to the cabin. Silas was a man of few words, his face weathered like old saddle leather, but he would not look Luke in the eye. He sat on his horse, hat in hand, while Clara watched from the safety of the darkened window. "Sheriff was out my way yesterday," Silas said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Asking about strays, asking about who has been coming and going on the road." Luke leaned against the porch post, his rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. "Is that so? He mentioned you, Luke," Silas continued, shifting in his saddle. "Asked if you had any company. Said there was talk of a woman involved in some theft over in Cheyenne. Said Preston Ward was offering a reward for information." Luke's jaw set hard. "There is no thief here, Silas." "I know that," Silas said quietly. "But the sheriff is not looking for truth. He is looking for a pay packet. He said he might just happen to ride by here in a day or 2, just to check on you." Silas put his hat back on, pulling the brim low. "I thought you should know. The wind is changing. Luke, it smells like smoke." When Silas rode away, the valley felt smaller. The vast horizon, which had always offered Luke a sense of freedom, now felt like a wall. They were trapped inside the cabin. Clara was pacing. Her limp was pronounced, aggravated by the stress, but she could not sit still. When Luke entered, she turned on him, her face pale and drawn. "He knows," Clara said. Her voice was thin, vibrating with fear. "Ward knows I am here. He sent the sheriff to scare you." "He sent the sheriff to see if I would blink," Luke said, barring the door. "I did not. You have to let me go," Clara said. It was an old argument now, worn smooth by repetition over the last few days, but this time there was a frantic edge to it. She began gathering her things, a comb, a ribbon, the few scraps of dignity she had left. "I can take the mare. I will ride south." "If I leave now, maybe they will follow me and leave you be." "You will not make it 10 miles, Luke said, hanging his hat on the peg. He moved to the stove, methodical and calm, though inside his stomach was churning with a cold rage. "Ward's men are watching the passes. They would catch you before you cross the creek." "Then let them catch me," Clara cried. She slammed her hand onto the table, the sound sharp in the small room. "Do you not understand? I am the poison. The women in town were right. I am the reason danger is at your door. I am the reason you are going to lose this land." She walked to him, grabbing the sleeve of his shirt. Her eyes were swimming with tears, desperate and pleading. "Luke, please, tell them I forced you. Tell them I lied to you. Give me to them. It is the only way to save yourself." Luke looked down at her. He saw the shame that had been beaten into her for years. She truly believed she was worth less than the dirt on his boots. She believed she was a bargaining chip to be traded for his safety. "Stop it," Luke said roughly. "I am trying to save you," Clara sobbed. "Why will you not let me?" "Because I am done running," Luke shouted. The volume of his voice startled them both. He seized her shoulders, his grip hard. "Do not you tell me about saving me. I watched my brother die because I thought keeping my head down would keep us safe. I thought if we followed the rules, the law would protect us. I was wrong." He pulled her closer, forcing her to look at him. "Matt died in the dirt because men like Ward think they own the world. They think they can take whatever they want, land, water, people, if I give you to them. Clara, I am not saving myself. I am killing the last good thing I have left inside me." Clara stared at him, her breath catching. "Luke, you are not a debt to be paid," Luke said, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You are under my protection, and I will burn this whole territory to the ground before I let them put a hand on you again." He released her and turned away, his chest heaving. Clara stood frozen, the warmth of his hands still ghosting on her shoulders. She realized then that this was not just about her. It was about his redemption, and terrifyingly, she realized she wanted to be the woman he was fighting for. The attack came 2 nights later. The wind had been blowing hard all day, drying out the grass until it crackled like paper. Luke had been restless, patrolling the perimeter with his Winchester, sensing the violence hanging in the air. It was just after sundown when Clara smelled it. She was sewing by the lamp, the needle flashing in the dim light. She paused, sniffing the air. "Luke?" she called out. Luke was already at the window. "I smell it." He threw the door open. The sky to the west was not dark. It was glowing a dull, angry orange. Smoke was rolling down the valley in thick, choking waves, carried by the wind. "Fire!" Luke yelled. "Get the sacks! Get the buckets!" It was an old trick of the range wars. Burn a man out. If the fire didn't kill him, it would destroy his grass, his fences, and his herd, leaving him with nothing but ash and debt. Clara scrambled up, forgetting her limp. She grabbed the burlap sacks they kept by the door for this very purpose. Luke was already at the water trough, soaking his own sacks. "Stay here," Luke ordered, turning to run toward the orange glow. "No!" Clara shouted. She plunged her sacks into the trough. the water icy cold on her hands. "It is too big for one man." She ran after him. Luke didn't argue. There was no time. The fire was moving fast, a line of living heat racing across the dry pasture toward the barn and the cabin. The flames leaped 10 feet in the air, fed by the sagebrush and the wind. The sound was a roar, like a freight train bearing down on them. They met the fire line with wet burlap and desperation. "Hit the base!" Luke screamed over the roar. "Smother it! Do not let it jump the break!" They fought side by side in the darkness, illuminated by the hellish light of the flames. They beat at the earth, the wet sacks hissing as they struck the burning grass. Smoke filled their lungs, stinging and acrid. Ash coated their faces, turning their sweat to gray mud. It was brutal, exhausting work. Every muscle in Clara's body screamed. Her bad leg throbbed with a sickening rhythm, but she did not stop. She swung the heavy, wet sack again and again, driven by a primal need to protect this place. This was Luke's home. It was the only sanctuary she had. "Over there!" Clara yelled, pointing to a spot where the wind had carried embers across their firebreak. "It is jumping!" Luke ran to the spot, shoveling dirt onto the new flames, smothering them before they could catch hold. He worked like a machine, his face a mask of soot and determination. They fought for an hour, maybe 2. Time lost its meaning. There was only the heat, the smoke, and the enemy that wanted to consume them. Finally, the wind shifted. It turned back on itself, driving the fire toward the creek bed where there was no fuel. The roar lessened. The flames began to die down, sputtering into glowing coals. Clara dropped her sack. Her knees gave way. The adrenaline that had held her up drained out of her in a rush, leaving her trembling and weak. She stumbled, pitching forward into the dirt. "Clara!" Luke was there in an instant. He dropped his shovel and scooped her up, hauling her away from the heat and the smoke. He carried her to the water trough near the corral, the only place where the air felt somewhat cool. He set her down, but her legs refused to hold her. She sagged against the wooden side of the trough, gasping for air, coughing up soot. Luke caught her, pinning her against the wood with his body to keep her from falling. He was panting, his chest heaving against hers. His face was streaked with black ash, his eyes wild and white-rimmed in the darkness. "Are you burned?" he demanded, his hands checking her arms, her shoulders, frantic with worry. "Clara, answer me. Are you burned?" "No!" Clara wheezed, shaking her head. I am all right. Just tired." She looked up at him. He was terrifying and beautiful in the firelight. He looked like a demon, covered in soot, but his eyes were filled with such raw, naked fear for her that it broke her heart. "I thought I lost you," Luke rasped. "When you fell, I thought—" He didn't finish. The distance between them had vanished. The polite walls they had built over weeks of living together had been burned away by the fire. There was no room for pretense anymore. There was only the fact that they were alive, and they were together. Luke looked at her mouth. It was stained with soot, trembling. He made a sound low in his throat, a growl of surrender. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was hard, clumsy, driven by the violent energy of survival. His mouth crushed hers, tasting of smoke and salt. His hands gripped her waist, bruising in their intensity, as if he needed to anchor her to the earth. Clara gasped against his lips, but she didn't pull away. She reached up, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. She kissed him back with a desperation that matched his own. She wanted this. She wanted the fire that wasn't destructive, the heat that promised life instead of death. Luke softened then. The frantic energy bled away, replaced by a deep, aching tenderness. His lips moved over hers, searching, asking. He tasted the grit of the ash and the sweetness of her breath. He pulled back, just an inch, their foreheads resting together. They were both gasping, their breath mingling in the cold night air. "Clara," he whispered. Her name sounded like a prayer on his lips. "Do not stop," she whispered back. Luke lifted her into his arms again. He carried her past the smoking remnants of the grass, past the frightened horses huddled in the corral, and into the cabin. Inside, the air was still heavy, but it was safe. Luke kicked the door shut, barring it against the world. He didn't light the lamp. The glow from the stove embers cast a dim, red light across the room. He carried her to the bed and set her down, but he didn't retreat to his corner this time. He stood over her, his hands hovering. "I am filthy," he murmured. "I will get soot on the quilts. I do not care," Clara said. She reached out and took his hand. His palm was rough, calloused, and covered in ash. She pressed it to her cheek. Luke shuddered. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, wiping away a smear of dirt. His touch was reverent, slow. He remembered the first time he had touched her skin, the accident, the slip of his hand on her thigh, the shame. Now, there was no shame. "May I?" he asked, his voice thick. "Yes," Clara breathed. He leaned in and kissed her again, slow and deep. His hands moved to the buttons of the oversized coat she still wore. His fingers were shaking, clumsy with anticipation. He undid the buttons one by one, parting the heavy wool. Clara helped him. She pushed the coat off her shoulders. She guided his hands to her waist, to the curve of her hip. She wanted him to know that this was her choice. For the first time in her life, she was not being taken, she was giving. Luke groaned as his hands found the warmth of her skin through her thin dress. He pulled her against him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled the scent of her, smoke and sweat and woman. They fell back onto the mattress, tangled together. The world shrank down to the sensation of skin on skin, of rough hands and soft lips. Luke moved over her, his weight heavy and grounding. He kissed her throat, her collarbone, the pulse that hammered at the base of her neck. His hand slid down her side, over her hip, and settled on her thigh. It was the same spot he had touched that first night. He paused, his fingers tightening slightly. Clara gasped, arching into his touch. "Luke," she whispered. "Please." The desire was a physical pain now, a tightening coil in his belly. He wanted her more than he had ever wanted anything. He wanted to lose himself in her, to forget the burned land and the men coming to kill him. He shifted, his hand moving higher, his body pressing down. Clara's legs parted, welcoming him. She clung to him, whispering his name, her hands roaming over the hard muscles of his back. They were on the precipice. One more movement, one more surrender, and there would be no going back. And then Luke stopped. He froze, his forehead pressed against hers. His breathing was ragged, harsh in the quiet room. He held himself still, his muscles trembling with the effort of control. "Luke?" Clara whispered, confused. She moved her hips, trying to bring him back. "No." Luke groaned. He pushed himself up, bracing his arms on either side of her head. He looked down at her. In the dim red light, his eyes were dark pools of emotion. "I want this," he said, his voice raw. "God, Clara, I want this more than my next breath." "Then take it," she pleaded. "Take me." "Not like this," Luke said. He shook his head, a bead of sweat dripping from his nose onto her cheek. "Not because we are scared, not because we almost died tonight, not because the world is burning down." He stroked her hair back from her forehead. "Ward treated you like something to be used, like something he could take when he wanted. If I take you now, in the dark, out of fear, I am no better than him." Clara stared up at him, her chest heaving. "I want more for you," Luke whispered. "I want to love you in the daylight. I want to love you when we are safe. I want you to know that I am choosing you, not just the moment." Clara felt a sob rise in her throat. It wasn't rejection. It was the opposite. It was a respect so profound she didn't know how to hold it. No man had ever stopped for her. No man had ever put her soul above his own hunger. "You are not like them?" she whispered, tears spilling from the corners of her eyes. "I am trying not to be," Luke said. He lowered his forehead to hers again. "I am trying to be the man you deserve." He rolled off her, lying beside her on the narrow bed. He pulled the quilt up over them both. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. Clara wept. She buried her face in his shirt and cried, for the fear, for the relief, for the sheer, overwhelming beauty of being seen. Luke held her, stroking her hair with his soot-stained hand, until the tears stopped and she fell into an exhausted sleep. The morning sun revealed the cost of the night. The world outside the cabin was a stark contrast of black and green. The fire had scoured a wide swath of the southern pasture. The grass was gone, replaced by a carpet of ash that swirled in the breeze. Luke walked the fence line, his boots crunching in the charred remains. Clara limped beside him, silent. They found the dead cattle in the gully. 3 of them. They hadn't burned. They had been shot. Luke knelt beside a yearling heifer. The bullet hole was clean, precise, right between the eyes. This wasn't a fire casualty. This was an execution. "They did this before they lit the grass," Luke said, his voice devoid of emotion. He stood up and walked a few paces to where the fence posts were burned down to blackened stubs. He kicked at something in the ash. He bent down and picked it up. It was a piece of leather, perhaps cut from a saddle fender or a cinch. It was scorched around the edges, but the brand stamped into the center was clear enough, a stylized W. The bar W, Preston Ward's brand. It wasn't just a calling card. It was a promise. Clara stared at the leather in Luke's hand. She felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, heavier than the breakfast she hadn't eaten. "He is not going to stop," Clara said softly. "He will burn the house next, then us." Luke turned the leather over in his hands. He looked at the dead cattle. He looked at the blackened earth that had been his livelihood. Something in his face changed. The stoic endurance that had defined him since his brother's death fractured. Beneath it, the old, hard iron of the gunman resurfaced. He dropped the leather into the dirt. "No," Luke said. "He is not going to stop. Not as long as we are hiding out here waiting for him to strike." He turned to Clara. His eyes were clear, the indecision gone. "Pack your things," he said. Clara froze. You are sending me away?" "No," Luke said. "We are going to town." "Town?" Clara grabbed his arm. "Luke, the sheriff!" "The sheriff is Ward's man." Luke cut in. "But there is a circuit judge due in Bitter Creek tomorrow. I heard Silas mention it." He looked toward the horizon, toward the town that despised them. "We are done running. Clara, we are done waiting for the fire to come to us." "You want to confront him?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Luke, he owns the town. He has hired guns." "I know," Luke said. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was steady. "But he expects us to run. He expects us to be afraid. He expects me to be the broken man who buried his brother and gave up." He squeezed her hand. "I am not that man anymore. Not since I found you." Clara looked at him. She saw the danger in his plan. It was suicide. It was madness. To ride into the heart of Ward's power and demand justice from a corrupt system. But then she looked at the burned land. She thought about the way Luke had held her the night before. She thought about the years she had spent cowering, letting Ward dictate her life because she was afraid to fight. A tiny, fragile spark of hope ignited in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was brighter than the fear. "If we go," Clara said, steadying her voice, "we go together. I will not let you stand alone." Luke nodded. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, brushing away a smudge of soot. "Together," he said. "Then let us go," Clara said. "Before I lose my nerve." Luke turned and walked toward the corral to saddle the horses. Clara watched him go, then turned back to the cabin. She had a dress to clean. If she was going to face Preston Ward and the town of Bitter Creek, she would not do it looking like a victim. She would do it standing tall, beside the man she loved. The hooves of the horses struck the hard-packed earth of Bitter Creek's main street with a rhythm that sounded like a slow, deliberate drumbeat. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung heavy and gold above the western horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched out ahead of Luke Carver and Clara Hale. They rode side by side. Luke sat easily on his roan, his back straight, his eyes scanning the storefronts and alleyways with the practiced vigilance of a man who expects trouble. Beside him, Clara rode the mare. She sat tall, her spine rigid, though every jolt of the horse sent a spike of pain through her healing leg. She wore her mended blue dress, the hem stained with the ash of the fire, and Luke's heavy duster coat draped over her shoulders like a mantle of protection. The town was quiet, but it was a heavy, watchful silence. As they passed the livery stable, the smith dropped his hammer and wiped his brow, staring. A woman shaking a rug on the balcony of the hotel froze, the fabric limp in her hands. Men standing outside the saloon stopped their conversation, their heads turning in unison to watch the scar-faced recluse and the fallen woman ride into the heart of the town that despised them. Whispers followed them, a soft, hissing trail like dry leaves skittering over stone. "That is him, Carver." And the girl, bold as brass. "I heard Ward put a price on her." Clara kept her eyes fixed forward, focusing on the ears of her horse. She felt naked under the gaze of the town, stripped of her dignity by the rumors that had preceded her. But she felt Luke's presence beside her, a solid wall of heat and strength, and it gave her the courage to keep her chin lifted. They pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, a small brick building with iron bars on the windows. Luke dismounted first, his boots hitting the dust with a heavy thud. He tied the roan to the rail, then moved to help Clara. He did not treat her like a porcelain doll this time. He gripped her waist firmly, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, grounding second as she slid down. "Ready?" he asked, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "Yes," Clara said, though her stomach was twisting in knots. They walked into the office. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper and tobacco smoke. Sheriff Brady sat behind his desk, his boots propped up on a stack of wanted posters. He looked up as the door opened, his gray eyes narrowing but showing no surprise. He had likely watched them ride in from the window. "Afternoon, Luke," Brady said, not moving his feet. "Miss Hale." "Sheriff?" Luke said. He stopped in the center of the room, his thumbs hooked near his belt, nowhere near his gun but ready. "I want to file a report," Brady sighed, dropping his feet to the floor. He picked up a pen and twirled it lazily. "A report? On what? The weather?" "On attempted murder," Luke said, his voice hard. "And arson. Preston Ward's men ambushed the stagecoach 3 weeks ago. They killed a passenger. They tried to kill Miss Hale. And last night, they set fire to my grazing land and shot 3 of my cattle." The sheriff raised an eyebrow, looking at Clara with a mixture of pity and disdain. "Those are heavy accusations. Luke, you have proof?" "I have the woman they tried to kill," Luke said, gesturing to Clara. "And I have a piece of leather stamped with the Bar W brand found in the ashes of my fence line." Brady chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "A piece of leather? Any man can cut a piece of leather. And as for the ambush, well, road agents are common in these parts. Blaming a respected man like Mr. Ward for the work of bandits is a dangerous game." "It was not bandits," Clara said. Her voice was shaking, but she forced it to steady. "I heard them. They spoke of Ward. They said he wanted loose ends tied up." Brady looked at her then, his gaze sliding over her worn dress and the man's coat she wore. "With all due respect, Miss Hale, your word is not exactly currency in this town. We all know why you left the Bar W. A woman who runs off with a man's money and then shows up living in a bachelor's cabin. Well, people talk. They say trouble follows you like a stray dog. Maybe you attracted those road agents. Maybe you attracted that fire." Luke took a step forward, his shadow falling across the sheriff's desk. "Are you saying she deserved it?" "I am saying," Brady said, his voice hardening, "that without proof, I cannot go arresting the biggest landowner in the territory just because his mistress had a run of bad luck." Clara felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. The word mistress hung in the air, ugly and condemning. She stepped out from behind Luke, her limp pronounced as she moved to the desk. She placed her hands flat on the wood and leaned in, looking the lawman in the eye. "I was not his mistress," Clara said clearly. "I was his purchase." Brady blinked, taken aback by her intensity. "My father owed Preston Ward $3,000, Clara said. The room went silent. "Ward offered to cancel the debt if I came to his ranch. He did not ask for a housekeeper. He did not ask for a companion. He bought me, sheriff, as surely as he buys his cattle. And when I refused to let him into my bed, when I locked my door against him, he punished me. He spread the rumors you so enjoy repeating. He told the town I was willing so that when I finally ran, no one would help me." Her voice wavered, threatening to crack, but she swallowed the tears. "I did not steal his money. I took only what was mine, and I will not be traded again, not by him and not by you." The sheriff stared at her. For a moment, the mask of indifference slipped, revealing a flicker of discomfort. He knew Preston Ward. He knew the man's cruelty, but he also knew the man's power. Before Brady could answer, the door behind them swung open. A touching performance. A smooth, baritone voice filled the room. Luke turned slowly. Preston Ward stood in the doorway. He was a handsome man in the way a wolf is handsome, sleek, groomed, and predatory. He wore a suit of charcoal wool that cost more than Luke's entire homestead, a silk cravat, and a silver gray hat. Flanking him were two men, hired guns with low-slung holsters and eyes that looked like dead stones. "Clara," Ward said, smiling as if he were greeting an old friend. "I see you have survived the elements. I was worried." "You were disappointed," Luke said, stepping between Ward and Clara. Ward's eyes flicked to Luke, dismissing him instantly. "Mr. Carver, I hear you have been harboring a fugitive. That is a crime, you know?" "She is not a fugitive," Luke said. "She is a free woman." "She is a thief," Ward corrected. Stepping into the room, the air suddenly felt very small. "She stole jewelry, my mother's pearls, and $500 in gold coin from my safe." "That is a lie," Clara cried. "I took nothing but my own locket." Ward sighed, shaking his head. "You see, Sheriff, she is hysterical. The guilt has unhinged her. She seduces this poor, violent drifter, spins him a tale of woe, and turns him against his betters." He looked at Luke with a sneer. "I understand. Carver, a man living alone on that rock you call a ranch. It must be lonely. A woman like Clara knows how to manipulate that. She knows exactly what a man wants to hear and exactly what he wants to feel." Luke's hands curled into fists. The urge to strike the smile off Ward's face was overwhelming, but he knew that was what Ward wanted. He wanted Luke to draw. He wanted an excuse for his hired dogs to open fire. "I know a liar when I hear one," Luke said quietly, "and I know a coward when I see one." Ward's smile vanished. His eyes went cold. "Sheriff, I want this woman arrested for grand larceny. And I want this man arrested for harboring a criminal and for the threats he made against my employee in the street 3 days ago." Brady looked between them. He was sweating now. On one side was Ward, who effectively owned his badge. On the other was Luke Carver, a man with a reputation for violence who looked ready to tear the building down, and a woman who had just spoken with a ring of truth that made Brady's stomach turn. "Now, hold on," Brady said, holding up his hands. "We are not hanging anyone today. Do your job." "Brady," Ward snapped. "I will," Brady said. He stood up. "But I will not do it in the dark. There is too much talk in this town already. If there are charges to be brought, we will hear them out in the open." He looked at Ward. "You say she stole. She says you attacked her. The circuit judge is not due until tomorrow, but we can hold a preliminary hearing tonight. Let the town hear the evidence. If there is cause, I will lock them up." Ward narrowed his eyes. He didn't like it. He wanted Clara in a cell, or better yet, in the back of his wagon. But he saw the determination in Luke's stance, and he saw the crowd gathering outside the window. "Fine," Ward said, smoothing his jacket. "Tonight, at the saloon, I will enjoy watching you try to defend a whore and a murderer. Carver, He turned and walked out, his spurs chiming on the floorboards. The sun had set, and the Bitter Creek saloon was packed to the rafters. Every table was full, and men stood 3 deep along the bar. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, acrid scent of kerosene from the lanterns that swung from the beams. Dust motes danced in the shafts of yellow light, swirling like tiny ghosts. The mood in the room was electric, a mixture of curiosity and bloodlust. It was better entertainment than a card game. It was the destruction of reputations. A space had been cleared in the center of the room. A table served as the bench for Sheriff Brady. To the left sat Preston Ward and a man named Silas Finch, a lawyer from Cheyenne who was known for his sharp tongue and lack of morals. To the right sat Luke and Clara. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white. She felt the eyes of the town on her, the women whispering behind their fans, the men leering or scowling. She felt small and dirty, just as Ward intended. Luke sat beside her, his chair angled slightly so that his body shielded hers from the main crowd. He wore his gun belt, the leather worn and dark. He kept his right hand on his thigh, close to the holster. "Let us get this over with," Sheriff Brady grunted, banging a gavel he had borrowed from the Masonic Lodge. "Mr. Ward brings charges of theft against Miss Hale." Silas Finch stood up. He was a thin man with spectacles that magnified his watery eyes. He paced the floor, looking at the crowd rather than the sheriff. "Ladies and gentlemen," Finch began, his voice oily, "we are here to discuss a tragedy, the tragedy of a benevolent man, Mr. Ward, who took in a destitute young woman out of the kindness of his heart." He turned to Clara, pointing a long, bony finger. "Miss Hale, is it not true that your father died penniless? Is it not true that Mr. Ward paid his debts?" "He bought the debts," Clara said, her voice trembling but audible. "To control him." "Control?" Finch scoffed. "He gave you a home, he gave you clothes, he gave you food. And how did you repay him? By seducing his ranch hands, by spreading lies, and finally, by running off in the night with his family heirlooms?" "I took nothing," Clara insisted. "We have witnesses," Finch said, waving a hand at the crowd. "Men who saw you flaunting jewelry. Men who heard you boasting about what you could get out of the boss." He leaned in close to her, invading her space. "Face it, Miss Hale, you are a woman of loose morals who got caught. And now you have found a new protector. Tell me, what did you promise Mr. Carver in exchange for his help? The same thing you promised the others?" "That is enough!" Luke's voice cracked through the room like a whip. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. Finch took a hasty step back. "Mr. Carver," the sheriff warned, "sit down." "I will not sit down while he twists the truth," Luke said. He looked at the crowd, ignoring the lawyer. "You all know me," Luke said. His voice was rough, unpolished, but it carried a weight that Finch's slick words lacked. "You know I killed a man in this town 3 years ago." A murmur rippled through the room. "I am not proud of it." Luke continued. "I let anger take the reins, and a man died. I have lived with that ghost every day. I moved out to the Badlands to get away from trouble, not to find it." He looked down at Clara, and his expression softened. "When I found this woman, she was bleeding to death in a wrecked stagecoach. She was terrified, not of the injury, but of the men who did it. She begged me not to bring her to town because she knew Ward's reach was long." Luke looked back at Ward, locking eyes with the rancher. "I cleaned her wound. I listened to her nightmares. I have seen her courage. She fought a fire to save my land 2 nights ago, a fire set by Ward's riders. A thief does not fight for another man's home. A whore does not ask for nothing but safety. He is bewitched," Ward called out from his seat, looking bored. "It is pathetic." "It is the truth," Luke roared. "She is the finest person I have ever known, and she is worth 10 of you. Ward." The room was silent. Luke's raw honesty hung in the air, clashing with the polished lies they had been fed. Some of the townsfolk shifted in their seats, looking uncomfortable. The women who had whispered about Clara looked down at their hands. "Eloquent," Finch sneered. "But words are not proof," "We have Mr. Ward's word against a drifter and a..." The saloon doors banged open. The sound was startlingly loud. Everyone turned. Silas Jensen stood in the doorway, supporting a man who looked more dead than alive. It was Miller, the stagecoach driver. His arm was in a sling, his face pale and bruised, but he was upright. "I have a witness," Jensen shouted. "This is irregular," Finch protested. "Let him speak," the sheriff said, sitting up straighter. Miller hobbled forward, supported by Jensen. He stopped in front of the sheriff's table. He looked at Preston Ward, and for the first time, fear flickered in Ward's eyes. "State your name," Brady said. "Thomas Miller," the driver wheezed. "I drove the stage from Cheyenne 3 weeks back." "Tell us what happened," Luke said gently. Miller took a breath. "We were hit at the canyon. 2 riders. They killed the fat man in the suit, shot the horses." "Bandits," Ward said loudly, "as we established." "They were not bandits," Miller said, his voice gaining strength. "They did not ask for the strongbox. They did not ask for the mail. They came to the door of the coach. I was on the ground, playing dead, but I heard them." The room was deadly quiet. One of them said, "Check the girl. Ward wants her alive if possible, dead if not." They said, "Ward wants loose ends tied up." A gasp went through the crowd. This was not hearsay. This was a direct accusation from a man who had no reason to lie. "You are a liar." Ward stood up, his face flushing red. "How much did Carver pay you?" "He paid me nothing," Miller said. "He saved my life. And that girl," he pointed at Clara, "she did not steal anything. She screamed. She tried to cover the clerk when the shooting started. She is innocent." The tide in the room turned. It was a physical shift. The townsfolk looked at Ward with sudden suspicion. The whispers started again, but this time they were directed at the man in the charcoal suit. "He tried to kill her. He set the fire. Maybe the girl is telling the truth." Ward heard the change. He felt his control slipping away, the meticulously crafted image of the benevolent rancher crumbling into dust. He looked around the room and saw judgment in the eyes of the people he considered beneath him. His ego, brittle and massive, snapped. "Shut up!" Ward screamed. The sheer volume of it shocked the room into silence. Ward stepped out from behind his table, his face twisted into a mask of ugly rage. "You think I care what you dirt farmers think?" Ward spat, looking at the crowd. "You hypocrites! You loved the gossip when it was about her being a whore. You ate it up, and now you want to judge me." He turned to Clara, his eyes black with hate. "And you ungrateful, used-up little bitch. I bought you. I own you. You think you can run to this broken-down cowboy and play the lady? You are nothing but damaged goods." Clara stood up. She did not flinch. "I am not goods," she said quietly. "I am a person." "You are mine," Ward roared. He turned to his hired guns, who were standing by the bar. "Grab her! If this town will not give me my property, I will take it." "No!" Luke shouted. The hired guns moved. One of them reached for his holster. Luke didn't hesitate. He shoved Clara hard, pushing her behind the heavy oak table they had been sitting at. "Down!" he yelled. As she fell, the room exploded. The hired gun fired. The bullet splintered the wood of the table inches from where Clara's head had been a second before. Luke drew. His motion was fluid, a muscle memory honed by years of survival. He didn't aim to kill. He aimed to stop the threat. He fired once, hitting the gunman in the shoulder. The man spun around, dropping his pistol with a cry. Chaos erupted. Women screamed and scrambled for the exits. Men dove under tables. Bottles shattered as patrons knocked them over in their haste to escape. The air filled instantly with thick, white gun smoke. Ward's second gunman opened fire, shooting wildly through the smoke toward Luke. Luke grabbed the edge of the heavy table and flipped it onto its side, creating a barricade. He grabbed Clara by the collar of the duster and hauled her down behind it. "Stay down," he ordered. A bullet slammed into the wood of the table, sending splinters flying into Luke's face. He winced, but didn't blink. He popped up, firing a shot that shattered the mirror behind the bar. Forcing the second gunman to duck, "Ward!" Luke shouted over the din. "Call them off!" Ward was standing in the middle of the room, behind his own overturned chair. He had drawn a small, silver-plated pistol. He wasn't looking for cover. He was looking for a clear shot at Clara. "She is mine!" Ward screamed, aiming at the gap in the tables. Luke saw the movement. He threw himself across Clara, shielding her body with his own. Crack! The bullet hit Luke. It tore a furrow across his upper arm, grazing the muscle. The pain was sharp and hot, like a branding iron. Luke grunted. His teeth clenched, but he didn't fall. He didn't let go of Clara. He pressed her face into the sawdust floor. Covering her head with his hand, he remembered the street where his brother died. He remembered the feeling of helplessness, of watching the life drain out of Matt while the law did nothing. Not this time, Luke thought. Not her. He rolled off her, ignoring the blood running down his sleeve. He rose to a crouch, his eyes locking on Ward through the haze of smoke. "Stop!" Sheriff Brady yelled, finally pulling his own gun and firing a shot into the ceiling. Everybody stop! But the violence had its own momentum now. Ward's eyes were fixed on Luke, filled with a madness that went beyond reason. He raised his pistol again. Luke leveled his Winchester. He had a clear shot at Ward's chest. He could end it. He could kill the man who had burned his land and tormented the woman he loved. But he saw Clara huddled on the floor, her hands over her ears. If he killed Ward now, in cold blood, the law would hang him, and Clara would be alone again. Luke shifted his aim. He fired. The bullet struck Ward's pistol, knocking it from his hand with a metallic clang. Ward gripped his numbed fingers, staring at the empty hand in shock. The room fell silent, save for the ringing in everyone's ears and the soft moans of the wounded gunman. Luke stood up slowly from behind the table, his gun still trained on Ward. Blood dripped from his fingertips onto the floor. "It is over. Ward!" Luke said, his voice shaking with the effort of not pulling the trigger again. "You are done." Ward looked around. His hired men were down or disarmed. The sheriff had his gun pointed at him. The townsfolk, those who hadn't fled, were staring at him with open hostility. But Ward did not surrender. He looked at Clara, who was peering over the edge of the overturned table. "It is never over," Ward hissed. He lunged, not at Luke, but at Clara. He moved with the desperation of a cornered animal. Grabbing Clara by the hair and dragging her up before Luke could react, he pulled a knife from his boot, a last hidden resort, and pressed the blade to her throat. "Back off!" Ward screamed, using Clara as a shield. "Back off, or I cut her throat right here!" Luke froze. The sheriff lowered his gun. The room held its breath. Clara felt the cold steel against her skin. She smelled Ward's cologne mixed with sweat and fear. She felt his heart hammering against her back. She looked at Luke. He was 10 feet away, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He couldn't shoot. Not without hitting her. Ward began to back toward the door, dragging Clara with him. "Nobody follows me," he panted. "I am taking what is mine." Clara looked at Luke's blood dripping on the floor. She saw the despair in his eyes. He had fought for her. He had bled for her. She felt a surge of cold, hard anger rise up in her chest. She was not a victim. She was not a bargaining chip. She was not property. She was Clara Hale, and she was done being afraid. As Ward dragged her past a heavy brass spittoon, Clara made her choice. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She waited. "Get the horses," Ward yelled to no one in particular. In that split second of distraction, Clara acted. The saloon doors burst open with a crash that splintered the dry wood, spilling the violence out into the twilight of Bitter Creek. Dust swirled in the street, kicked up by the frantic hooves of horses tethered at the rail, their eyes rolling white with panic at the smell of gunpowder and blood. Preston Ward dragged Clara backward through the dirt, his grip on her hair so tight she thought her scalp would tear. She stumbled, her boots scraping uselessly against the hard-packed earth, her injured leg dragging like a dead weight. The cool evening air hit her face, a shocking contrast to the stifling heat of the saloon. but it brought no relief. "Back off!" Ward screamed, his voice shredding the throat. He pressed the cold muzzle of his pistol against Clara's temple. "I will kill her! Do not think I will not!" Luke emerged from the darkness of the saloon entrance. His Winchester held low but steady. Blood soaked the sleeve of his shirt, turning the fabric black in the failing light, but his hand did not shake. He stopped at the edge of the boardwalk, his boots heavy on the wood. The street was emptying fast. Townsfolk who had been lingering to hear the verdict now scrambled for the safety of the alleyways and rain barrels. Windows slammed shut. The world had narrowed down to 3 people standing in the dust. "Let her go, Ward," Luke said. His voice was not a shout. It was a flat, dead thing, devoid of hope or mercy. "There is nowhere to run." "Run?" Ward laughed, a high, jagged sound that bordered on madness. He hauled Clara tighter against his chest, using her body as a shield. "I do not run. I own this town. I own the law. And I own this whore." Clara felt the vibration of his shout in her own bones. She smelled the fear on him, sour and metallic, lurking beneath the expensive cologne. He was trembling. The man who had loomed over her life like a dark mountain for 2 years was shaking. He dragged her toward his black stallion, which was dancing nervously at the hitching post. "You get back!" Ward yelled at Luke. "You go back to your dirt patch and rot. She is coming with me. She has a debt to pay." Clara looked at Luke. He was 20 feet away. Too far. If he fired, he risked hitting her. She saw the agony in his eyes, the hesitation that Ward was counting on. Something inside Clara snapped. It was not a loud break, but a quiet, stealing shift. For years, she had been paralyzed by the fear of pain, by the fear of shame, by the belief that she was small and helpless against men like Ward. But she was not that woman anymore. That woman had died in the stagecoach wreck. The woman who survived had walked through fire. Ward shifted his weight, reaching for the reins of his horse with his free hand, momentarily taking his eyes off her to glance at the saddle. Now, Clara did not scream. She did not pull away. Instead, she drove her heel down with all the force she possessed. The hard leather heel of her boot slammed into the arch of Ward's polished shoe, crushing the small bones of his foot. Ward howled, his grip loosening just a fraction. In that second of shock, Clara twisted. She did not try to run. She turned into him, burying her teeth into the wrist of the hand that held the gun. She bit down hard, tasting salt and skin, locking her jaw like a wolf. "You bitch!" Ward shrieked. His reflex was to jerk his hand away. The gun went off. Crack! The shot went wild, tearing a hole in the wooden overhang of the general store. The sound echoed up into the vast, darkening sky. Ward flailed, shoving Clara away violently. She lost her footing and fell hard, hitting the dirt with a bone-jarring thud. Her bad legs screamed in protest, and the breath was knocked out of her. But she scrambled backward, clawing at the dust, putting space between herself and him. "Clara!" Luke shouted. Ward spun around, clutching his bleeding wrist, his face a mask of pure, animal rage. He raised the gun again, but Clara was on the ground now, out of the line of fire. Luke stepped off the boardwalk. He walked into the middle of the street. The wind whipped his duster around his legs. He looked at Ward, and, for a moment, the years peeled back. It was the same street where his brother Matt had died. It was the same dust, the same hush, the same feeling of the world holding its breath while 2 men decided who would live. But this time, Luke was not watching from the sidelines, and this time, he was not alone. Clara pushed herself up to her knees. She was bruised, her dress torn, her hair falling in wild tangles around her face, but she did not hide. She did not cower. She watched Luke, her eyes fierce and burning. "She is mine," Ward ranted, swaying on his injured foot. "I paid for her. I bought her debt. You cannot take what is mine." "She is not a horse, Ward," Luke said. He levered a fresh round into the chamber of his rifle. The sound was loud and mechanical. Clack, clack. "And she is not land. You cannot buy a soul." "I can buy anything," Ward shouted. He gestured wildly with his gun, encompassing the town, the mountains, the very sky. That is how the world works. Carver, men like me build it, men like me own it, and men like you. You just exist to serve us. You are dirt. You are nothing. Maybe, Luke said softly. But the dirt endures. The dirt is still here when the storm is over. He took another step. Put the gun down. Preston, it is done. Ward looked at Luke. He looked at the blood on his own wrist. He looked at Clara, who was staring at him not with fear, but with pity. The pity broke him. No, Ward whispered. No one takes from me. He raised the pistol. He did not aim at Luke. Spite, pure and venomous, drove his hand. He swung the barrel toward Clara, intent on destroying the one thing he could not control. Luke did not hesitate. He did not think. He simply moved. The Winchester barked once, a single sharp report that cut through the ranting, the wind, and the history of violence that held them all captive. The bullet struck Preston Ward in the chest. Ward staggered back. He looked surprised. He looked down at the flower of red blooming on his white shirt, spreading across the silk of his cravat. His gun slipped from his fingers and fell into the dust. He looked up at Luke, his mouth opening as if to speak, to assert his ownership one last time. But no sound came out. He collapsed. He hit the ground heavily, face up to the sky that did not care about his money or his name. His expensive clothes soaked up the dirt and the blood, indistinguishable from the earth he had tried to conquer. Luke stood over him, his chest heaving. The rifle smoked in his hands. The silence that followed was absolute. Luke looked at the body. He waited for the guilt. He waited for the crushing weight that had followed Matt's death. But it did not come. Instead, he felt a strange hollowness. It was finished. The ghost was gone. Luke, the voice was a whisper. He turned. Clara was standing. She limped toward him, ignoring the crowd that was slowly beginning to emerge from the shadows. She reached him and took the rifle from his hands, leaning it against her leg. Then she took his hands in hers. They were shaking. Both of them were shaking. Sheriff Brady walked out of the saloon. He looked tired. He looked old. He walked to Ward's body and nudged it with his boot, verifying what he already knew. He looked up at Luke. He looked at Clara, standing tall beside him. He looked at the witnesses peering from the windows, the people who had seen Ward drag a woman by her hair, who had seen him use her as a shield, who had heard him threaten to murder her in cold blood. The sheriff took off his hat and wiped his forehead. He could arrest Luke. He could try to spin this for Ward, even now. But he saw the faces of the townsfolk. The fear had broken. Ward was dead, and his power had died with him. He drew on an unarmed woman, Brady said loudly, addressing the street. I saw it. You all saw it. He looked Luke in the eye. Self-defense. Clear as day. Luke let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. He nodded once to the sheriff. Get him out of the street. Brady ordered his deputies, his voice weary. The show is over. Luke did not wait to watch them take the body away. He put his arm around Clara, taking her weight as she leaned into him. Let us go home, he said. Yes, Clara whispered, resting her head against his bloody shoulder. Let us go home. The days that followed were a slow, quiet struggle, like waking up from a long fever. The town of Bitter Creek did not change overnight. There were no parades, no sudden embrace of the outcasts, but the venom was gone. The poison that Preston Ward had injected into the community began to fade with his passing. The guilt came in small, awkward gestures. When Luke rode in to see the doctor about his arm, a clean furrow that needed stitching but would heal, the blacksmith refused to take payment for shoeing the roan. He didn't say he was sorry for staring while Ward mocked them. He just hammered the iron and said, On the house, Luke. When Clara went to the general store to buy flour and sugar, bracing herself for the cold shoulders, Mrs. Gable was there. The boarding house owner turned red when she saw Clara. She busied herself with a bolt of calico, refusing to meet Clara's eyes. But as Clara was leaving, Mrs. Gable hurried to the counter. Miss Hale, she called out. Clara stopped, turning slowly. I have some extra yeast, Mrs. Gable said, her voice tight. And some dried apples. They will go bad if I do not use them. Take them. Clara looked at the woman. She saw the shame there, and the olive branch extended in the only way these hard, proud people knew how. Thank you, Mrs. Gable, Clara said softly. That is kind of you. We did not know. Mrs. Gable stammered. About the debt, about how he treated you. You knew enough, Clara said. She didn't say it with malice, just with a quiet truth. But thank you for the apples. She walked out into the sunlight, leaving the woman standing in the silence of her own conscience. Back at the cabin, the land was healing faster than the people. The black scar across the southern pasture began to soften. Under the spring sun, green shoots pushed up through the ash, feeding on the nutrients of the burned grass. The earth was resilient. It took the fire and turned it into life. Luke worked from dawn until dusk. He replaced the burned fence posts, digging new holes in the rocky soil. His arm was stiff, but he worked through the pain, finding comfort in the rhythm of the labor. Clara worked beside him. She was no longer the fragile creature who had arrived in the storm. Her limp was still there, and perhaps it always would be. A hitch in her step to mark the journey, but she was strong. She learned to ride the mare with confidence, her body moving in rhythm with the horse. She learned to herd the scattering of calves that had survived the winter. She learned to mend fence, her hands becoming rough and brown from the sun and the wire. She wore practical clothes now, a divided skirt and a sturdy shirt, but she walked with a grace that belonged to the land itself. Their love grew in the spaces between the work. It wasn't a sudden explosion of passion, but a deepening root system. It was in the way Luke would stop chopping wood just to watch her walk across the yard, his eyes softening with a look of wonder that she was still there. It was in the way Clara would bring him a ladle of water from the well, her fingers brushing his as he took it, a silent language of touch that grounded them both. One evening, a month after the shooting, a thunderstorm rolled over the mountains. It was a gentle storm, bringing rain instead of fire. They sat inside the cabin. The lamp turned low. Luke was sitting on a stool, and Clara sat on the floor between his knees. He was brushing her hair. It had become a ritual. Her hair was long and thick, the color of dark honey in the lamplight. Luke held the brush in his large, scarred hand. He moved it with infinite care, pulling it through the strands from scalp to tip. He remembered the first time he had touched her, the shaking hands, the blood, the fear that he would hurt her. Now, his touch was steady. He traced the line of her neck with his thumb. "Does that hurt?" he asked quietly, working a tangle loose. "No," Clara murmured, leaning back against his legs. "It feels good." She reached up and took his free hand, intertwining her fingers with his. She looked at their hands together, his large and dark, hers smaller but no longer soft. They fit. "You are thinking," Luke said, feeling the tension in her shoulders. "I am thinking about the fence," Clara said. "We need to finish the north line before the herd moves." Luke chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "You sound like a rancher." "I am a rancher," Clara said. She turned her head to look up at him. "I am your partner, am I not?" Luke stopped brushing. He looked down at her face, illuminated by the golden light. He saw the scars on her soul, and she saw his. They were two broken things that had mended each other. "Yes," Luke said, thick with emotion. "You are." Later that night, the rain tapped a steady rhythm against the roof. The fire in the stove had died down to glowing coals. They lay in the narrow bed, the quilts pulled up against the chill. For weeks, they had slept beside each other, holding hands, sharing kisses that were tender and careful. They had been waiting for the fear to fully leave the room, waiting for the ghost to depart. Tonight, there were no ghosts. Luke turned to her. He ran his hand down the curve of her side, resting his palm on her hip. "Clara," he whispered. She turned to him. Her eyes were open, clear and certain. "I am here," she said. She reached for him. She pulled him close, her skin warm against his. When they finally came together, it was not with the frantic desperation of the fire. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was a claiming, but not of ownership. It was an offering. Luke moved over her, his weight familiar and safe. He kissed her deeply, pouring every unsaid word into the contact. He worshipped her with his hands and his body, treating her not as something fragile to be protected, but as something sacred to be cherished. Clara met him. She opened herself to him completely, letting go of the last vestiges of the shame Ward had planted in her heart. She felt powerful. She felt beautiful. She felt seen. In the quiet dark, with the rain falling on the roof, they found a language that healed the last of the wounds. It was a joining of trust and want, a fierce affirmation that they had survived, and that they belonged to no one but each other. In the aftermath, they lay tangled in the thin sheets, the cool air from the window washing over their heated skin. Luke held her against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. Clara listened to the steady beat of his heart, a sound that had become her favorite song. "The cabin is too small," Luke said suddenly, his voice rumbling in his chest. Clara smiled against his skin. "It is cozy. It is a shack," Luke corrected. "We need another room, maybe two." "Two," Clara teased, tracing a scar on his chest with her finger. "What do we need 2 more rooms for?" Luke was silent for a moment. "There are children in Cheyenne," he said softly. "Orphans, boys and girls who lost their folks to the fever or the road, like we were lost." Clara went still. She lifted her head to look at him. His face was open, vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "You want children?" she asked. "I want a life," Luke said. "I want to plant trees, cottonwoods, down by the creek, trees that will take 50 years to grow tall. I want to build something that lasts longer than me." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "But only if you want it, only if this is enough for you." Clara looked around the shadowy cabin. It was rough, it was isolated. The wind outside was relentless, and the work was hard. But it was filled with love. It was filled with peace. "It is not enough," Clara said, leaning up to kiss him. "It is everything." The story ends on a morning in late summer. Luke and Clara stood side by side on the ridge overlooking their land. The sun was rising, painting the Wyoming sky in strokes of violent violet and burning gold. Below them, the valley was green. The cattle were grazing near the creek, their coats shining in the light. A row of saplings, fragile but upright, lined the water's edge, the promise of shade for a generation they might never see. Luke stood with his arm around Clara's shoulders. He was grayer at the temples now, the lines around his eyes deeper, but the haunted look was gone. He looked like a man who had found his anchor. Clara leaned into him. Her limp was there, a part of her, but she stood strong. She wore a simple ring of hammered silver on her finger, made by the blacksmith who had once turned away from her. They looked out at the wild, harsh landscape. It was a brutal country. It would freeze them in winter and bake them in summer. It would try to break them again. They knew that. The storms would always come. But as the wind whipped their hair and the sun warmed their faces, they did not look afraid. They looked like the land itself, scarred, weathered, and undeniably alive. "Ready?" Luke asked, looking down at her. Clara smiled, a fierce, bright thing that outshone the sun. "Ready," she said. They turned together and walked back down the hill, toward the home they had built from the ashes. 2 stubborn souls who had dared to plant hope in the hard earth and watch it grow. Thank you, friends, for riding this long, dusty trail with me. It has been a pleasure to share the story of Luke and Clara with you, a tale of grit, redemption, and the kind of love that only grows in the hardest soil. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you watching the sun rise over the mountains, or the city lights flicker on? Leave a comment below and let me know. And if you enjoyed this journey into the American West, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. There are many more stories to tell. Stories of outlaws and lawmen, of heartbreaks and horizons, Share your thoughts on Luke and Clara's ending in the comments. I read every one. Until next time, keep your fences mended and your powder dry.